So we're coming to that. We're coming to the ultimate property clash, dealing with this invasion problem. We're going to see if this concept of property, as we've been discussing, still exists, or whether Klaus Schwab is correct. Right? We'll have no property in the United States because anyone in the world can come in here and just take over. What is the indicium or protector of individual freedom? It's the ability to have property or the control of property, the use of property. I have no freedom if all of the things that I would want to use or control are subject to someone else's control. Basically, I'm a slave.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for January 29th through February 5th, 2024, while supplies last. This week we have silver Valcambi or Asahi 100-ounce bars at just $1.39 over spot per ounce. We also feature pre-1933 gold $10 and $20 Liberties at $89 over melt and $139 over melt, respectively. Next, backdated 1-ounce silver maples are at $3.75 over spot with a minimum order of 50. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
And let's take an example. I think you mentioned this when you put Governor Abbott there in Texas. And he has a situation. It's called an invasion. Situations like this are well known historically. The Roman Empire, they had the barbarian invasions. Huge numbers, these foreign tribes coming in from Germany and so forth, being driven by the tribes behind them, right? They were migrating because they were being forced out of the property that they had by some other tribe coming at them, and they were coming across the Rhine River into the Roman Empire, and they called that the barbarian invasions. Well, that's what they were. Huge numbers of people, illegally, according to the Roman law, I suppose, crossing into Roman territory to settle. Maybe even simply to take over unoccupied land. But to settle and then to gain whatever benefits there were of living within the boundaries of the Roman Empire, all illegally done. And so there was Caesar with the Gallic Wars and so on. What was that all about? All right, so that's what we have now. Now, these huge masses of people, they're coming in here illegally to obtain benefits to which they are not entitled, among which ultimately, apparently now in many instances, include voting, which control the political, well, participation in the political process, to which they're obviously not entitled. And you have a government in Washington, so-called government in Washington, which is simply looking the other way, facilitating this as much as possible, in league with probably the government of Mexico. Because huge numbers of illegal aliens, they trek across the length of Mexico. You know, they don't bring these people in by helicopter and drop them at the Rio Grande. There's huge caravans of people marching through Mexico. How do you get into Mexico without some kind of paperwork? Mexico just let people in at its southern border and say, why are you coming in? Oh, we're coming in to go illegally into the United States. Oh, fine, go ahead. Cross Mexico to go illegally into the United States. There's a special visa that we have for illegal immigrants crossing into the United States. Is that the case? Well, it apparently is the case. Something along those lines. The Mexican government is complicit in this. So I guess it's more of an invasion than we really think. And then, of course, there are the armed cartels, which are complicit with the Mexican government, probably control the Mexican government, and are complicit with the Red Chinese. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not cumulative millions of people from all over the world. Right? They're not just from Guadalajara or something. They're from all over the world, somehow getting into this process. Somebody's paying the freight here. Somebody's making the organizational steps operational. So this huge mass of humanity can make this transfer from wherever they're coming from. And it's really all over the world, not just from Central America or South America. All right, so what are they, swimming across the Atlantic? like the boat people from Cuba, rubber tires and dinghies and so forth. No, they're not. They have to be on planes. Someone's paying for this, all right? So it's a highly orchestrated and financed invasion involving at least two countries directly, Mexico and China, involving armed bands of criminals, these cartels, and up to millions of people coming to the United States to obtain benefits to which they're not entitled, and ultimately to become, well, quote unquote, voting citizens. They're not citizens at all. They have no right to vote, but they'll be voting. To somehow influence the political process and maybe in some areas dominate and control it. So they actually take over the governments, which I take it is more than happened in the barbarian invasions. So it is invasion. No question of it. Anyone who says it isn't is just, he's either totally ignorant or he has some political axe he's trying to grind. Now, Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. Everyone should read Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, maybe 5 or 6 times. It says, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, now go on, engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. No state without the consent of Congress shall engage in war, etc. Well, what does that mean? Read it the other way around. When a state is actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay, it may engage in war without the consent of Congress. And that means without the dissent of Congress either. Congress has no say over the matter. When a state is invaded, Congress has no say of the matter as to the states engaging in war to suppress that invasion. End of discussion. It has nothing to do with the immigration laws of the United States. This is an explicitly reserved power of the states under those circumstances. So all this talk about whether there's immigration preemption, blah, 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 that's all baloney. This power cannot be limited by anything Congress does or doesn't do. The powers of Congress are powerless, if you will, with respect to a state engaging in war when actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. It's right there in the Constitution of the United States. So what is going on in Texas with all this nonsense? If the Texas National Guard, and I wouldn't tell Abbott to put out the National Guard because National Guard is actually an adjunct of the Army of the United States, so we got a problem there. They should call what they call the Reserve Militia in Texas. There are probably 7 million of those people, I would guess. There are 4 million of them in Virginia, so population-wise, probably 7 million of them in Texas. And probably most of those people are armed already, so arm them, give them some kind of uniform. Give them a little bit of modicum of training, and send them down there. And I don't know what the problem is. I don't know what the problem is with the Supreme Court. There was an injunction in favor of Texas, as I understand it. And so this thing was overturned. It goes up to the Supreme Court because, no, we're not going to allow that to happen. Well, wait a minute. Why not? An injunction is granted when there's a reasonable likelihood of success on the merits. It's in the public interest. But the key is reasonable likelihood of success on the merits. If you don't have a reasonable likelihood of success on the merits, you never get anywhere near an injunction. Well, is there a reasonable likelihood of success on the merits when the Constitution specifically says that Congress has no power to interfere with a state engaging in war when actually invaded? You think that a state that's actually invaded doesn't have a reasonable likelihood of success on the merits? See, this is you don't have to go to Harvard Law School. In fact, it's probably a detriment to go to Harvard Law School now. But you don't have to go to Harvard Law School to read that provision of the Constitution and say, well, why is this in there? Well, because invasions sometimes happen very quickly. Number one, the state can't wait around. Congress may not even be in session to get consent. Or, number two, the invasion may be something that a bunch of traitors in Congress are agreeing with. Or incompetence. Let's not necessarily call them traitors, but they're incompetence one way or another. They're ideological fanatics of some kind, right? And so they would not come forward and consent to this. Meanwhile, the state is being invaded. And this was, if you go to the Declaration of Independence says one of the things that these independent states are now going to assert, right? Because there's a list of them at the end. All right. Let me see if I can just get this so I can read it exactly to you. Okay, this is the conclusion. That these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown and all political connection to the state of Great Britain, totally dissolved. And as free and independent states, they have full power, what's the first one? To levy war. As free and independent states, they have full power to levy war. Conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may have right to do. So the first one is to levy war. The first power that's recognized in the Declaration of Independence for the independent states is to levy war. And we find in Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, the retained power of the states to engage in war when actually invaded. How could it be more clear? All right? And granted, if you had only 1,500 illegal aliens coming across the border, sneaking across the border every year, you say, well, maybe this isn't an invasion. But the numbers now, these huge masses coming across Mexico with the cartels as their facilitators, with the Mexican government as their facilitator, with the Chinese government, at least in terms of drug trafficking, as the facilitator of this. You're going to tell me this is an invasion? I mean, some people would look at it and say, this is sufficient to declare war on Mexico. Right? Remember the Marine hymn from the halls of Montezuma? What were they talking about there? The last war with Mexico. So maybe that would be the solution. But I can't believe that anyone could make a cogent argument that this is not, in dictionary terms, an invasion. Therefore, and yet people are out there talking about, as if this was some kind of political balancing act that's going on here, right? And that the Border Patrol has some superior authority to the Texas. Well, I would hope the Texas militia, but the National Guard, because he doesn't understand what he's really doing. But all right, National Guard. He sends out the National Guard. The Border Patrol has some superior authority to the Texas National Guard in enforcing the border attack, which is obviously false. Who created the Border Patrol? Congress, right? Border Patrol is an example of the consent of Congress. They passed a statute. And now Congress is trying to use the Border Patrol to dissent from the state's authority to engage in war when the Constitution says that the consent of Congress is not required. And therefore, the dissent of Congress is irrelevant. So these are the problems. And if you look at that one in particular with respect to property, well, hell, that's not just the property of Texas in the sense that these people are trespassers. A minimum. They're trespassing all across the country. And they are, eating up all sorts of property to which they're not entitled. You take a look at New York. Of course, you've got Eric Adams, the New York mayor, who was previously one of the great sanctuary cities proponents. And now he's discovering that these various funds and facilities that New York has that would be used for, we would hope, the homeless people in New York, American citizens, they are woefully too small to take care of this influx of aliens into New York City. And the influx of aliens in New York City is nothing compared to the influx of aliens into Texas that are still there. Oh, Adams doesn't like that. Well, what does that tell you? What are these aliens doing? They're eating up all of this property to which they're not entitled. Isn't it the essence of one of the essences of barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire? The people, the barbarians, so-called, were coming in and taking over property. There were huge potential economic drain on the people who were already there, the Roman citizens or the Roman auxiliaries or whatever, the ones recognized by the Romans as having some kind of property interest. So this is like the ultimate example of all the other things we've talked about, going all the way back to the foolishness of the national government having eminent domain power, and the Constitution says the opposite. Here we have the foolishness of the national government saying that the states can't protect themselves against invasion, the ultimate attack on property, when the Constitution specifically says they can. And the media and the politicians, I've been watching this for the last few days, trying to look at some of the quote, right-wing media, as they call it. I know right-wing, left-wing, it's all nonsense, right? That's all a fallacy, the fallacies that are generated. But Fox News is considered to be something of a right-wing outfit. And generally, their people support Abbott, I would guess, from listening to some of them. But they don't pick up on this. Even they are talking about this conflict with the Border Patrol as if there is some, preemption concept involved here. The congressional statute somehow can control what a state does. And that goes back to the Arizona versus United States case. Arizona passed a statute that had certain kinds of controls built into it on immigration, illegal immigration. And I went up to the Supreme Court, and of course the Supreme Court ruled, oh, no, this is preempted because Arizona is attempting to pass immigration laws that are contrary to, actually they were in many instances supplementary to. They were attempts to enforce the same provisions that Congress had enacted because Congress and the executive wasn't doing what it's supposed to do, weren't doing what they're supposed to do. So you can say, oh, this is preempted because a state law that's quote unquote interfering in some way, and interference could be negative or could be positive, whatever, with congressional statutes. And you say, well, okay, in principle, that's right. If power over immigration has been delegated to Congress, then the states cannot, consistently with the Supremacy Clause, pass statutes that in one way or another interfere with the exercise of that congressional power, positively or negatively. They can't add to it. They can't take away from it. Fine. That's because there's a specifically delegated power to Congress with respect to this matter. But here we have a explicitly reserved power of the states, which means there is no power with respect. This isn't the 10th Amendment where we're talking about generalities. We don't exactly know. This is a specific power. The states do not need the consent of Congress. End of discussion. So here we go. We have gotten to the point now where our government, a state government, which has the explicit power to protect the property of certainly of its own citizens, let alone the citizens in other states where the illegal aliens may spread, is now being told no. And being told by whom? Well, I think it's going to be told by the Supreme Court. I have a feeling that's what's going to happen here. Because of the way this last thing with Conan Barrett and Roberts siding with the other liberals to get a 5-4 decision the wrong way. Looks to me like when this thing comes up on the merits, it's going to go the wrong way. But the media, including the so-called, I would call them the right-wing media, one would think, well, first thing you're going to do is you're right-wing. You're going to look at the Constitution, right? I mean, theoretically, the right-wing media is concerned with the Constitution. The left-wing media is concerned with nothing legal, right? It's all political. Right-wing media is concerned with the Constitution. You look at the Constitution, and you would find this, because even Abbott has talked about this. Even Abbott is saying that he has the right to send the Texas National Guard to the border because there's an invasion, and there is this Article 1, Section 10 authority of the states. Isn't that the end of the point? Isn't that the point that's the end of the issue? You look at the Constitution, here's the power, here's what's happening, the state has the right then to take these actions. End of discussion. We don't talk about politics. We don't worry about Mr. Biden versus Mr. Trump in the next election. It's right here and now, and this is the end of it. And I would bet under the Texas Constitution, if it's anything similar to the Virginia Constitution, Abbott is made the commander-in-chief of the Texas militia, one of the militia of the several states, right? And every one of these statutes I've ever looked at, one of the things, not the militia of the state, is authorized to do, and the governor is authorized to do as a commander, is to repel invasions. Repel invasions, suppress insurrections, execute the laws. And then in Virginia, they have a couple of provisions dealing with natural disasters and emergencies. Okay, it goes beyond what's in Congress's power. Execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasions. And you see that tripartite authority reproduced, at least in every militia statute I've ever looked at. Can't say I've looked at all of them, but every one I've looked at. And that's logical, because the first point is you don't even have a state unless you can repel invasions. Right? Second Amendment. Well, regular militia being necessary is the security of a free state. What is the security of a free state? What is the security of any state? It's the maintenance of its borders. If barbarian invasions can occur over and over again, you can't do anything about it. You don't have a political entity that you control. Right? This is like high school political science, right? First principle. That's why the country is divided in all these governmental entities, and they're all defined by borders. The counties, the cities, the towns, the states, the national government, the territories of the United States, Guam, Puerto Rico, whatever. Go on and on and on. They're all defined by borders. And this is the point made in Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. It is so important that Congress is excluded from having any control over, any say over it one way or the other, including, as it says, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace. Stop right there. State engages in war. At the time of war, I would take it, as opposed to one of peace. Therefore, the state can keep troops, not just militia, which are separate from troops, but standing armies, because that's what they had at the time of the Constitution. There were the state militias, which were everybody, and then they drew from those the state troops, which were volunteers, and then the state troops, in many instances, became part of the Continental Army, or at least adjuncts of the Continental Army. That was the structure. And the Constitution says, well, no, we're not going to have troops in time of peace. The states cannot have their own troops in time of peace without the consent of Congress. That's the National Guard. And they can have armies. Congress can create armies, because there's no limitation on Congress's power to raise armies. Can raise armies in time of peace, that's fine. But the states can't keep their own troops unless Congress consents. But the militia are always there. Why? Because it says militia of the several states. There's no consent of Congress tied to that at all. So here's Abbott. Abbott's in a position where now he could say, well, number one, I could raise troops separate from the National Guard. And the reason I say that is because the National Guard is specifically made an adjunct of the Army. That's how this game was played. So it's conceivable, I haven't heard that Biden was threatening this yet, that Biden could, as they used to say, federalize the National Guard. Remember when you had the segregationists, Orville Forbes in Arkansas, and what was his name there in Alabama, George Wallace, standing in the schoolhouse doors, right? When they weren't going to when they had segregated schools, and they weren't going to allow the desegregation, and the governors were there. Well, why didn't the governors use the National Guard in those states to protect segregation? And the answer was, well, because the presidents, JFK initially, nationalized the National Guard. And so the National Guards became instruments of desegregation out of the control of the governors. Good for Kennedy. All right, stop that business. Okay? But that was because the National Guard are troops which Congress consented for the states to keep in time of peace, subject to certain conditions. And one of those conditions is those troops are subject to federal control. All right? So Abbott, if this, I could predict this, if this comes to a real push and shove between Biden and Abbott, at some point the Biden people are going to say, no, you can't use the National Guard because we're going to federalize them and take control of them ourselves as adjuncts of the Army. Then, of course, you get into the Posse Comitatus Act, where the army can be used to enforce the laws in the country, blah, 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 whatever. But it's conceivable that the Biden people would try to take the National Guard away from Abbott. And then what would Abbott do? Well, he'd have, I guess, the Texas State Police, Texas Rangers and whatever, the real heroes that went into the Uvalde school shooting, right? He'd have that bunch of people. Or he would have the several million members of what's called the reserve militia. And under the Texas statute, look at this, reserve militia can be called out by the governor for any purpose that he sees fit. So certainly to repel invasions. So we're coming to that. We're coming to the point now where if this clash, the ultimate property clash, dealing with this invasion problem, we're going to see if this concept of property, as we've been discussing, still exists. Or whether Klaus Schwab is correct. Right? We'll have no property in the United States because anyone in the world can come in here and just take over. And our governmental entities, the two big ones at the federal level, are not going to do anything because they're controlled by people that want the invasion. And at the state level, they're controlled by people who have been told that they can't oppose the invasion, and they go along with that. So you tell me, where this will lead. I don't think it's to, a position we want to be in. It would be much smarter if the people in Washington, D.C. said, yeah, well, we'll put the burden of enforcement on the Texas people if they want to do it. Go ahead, send all of your National Guard there, et cetera, and see if they can solve the problem. But the people in Washington want the invasion to go on. That's obvious. So they could stop it tomorrow morning. They could send a couple of divisions of the United States Army to the border and tell the Mexicans, if this continues, we'll just keep moving south until we get to Mexico City. And you would find the Mexican Army and the Mexican police up there on the border stopping this thing the next day. All right. So we know that that's not going to happen. So the whole progression here, and this is the ultimate, right? You have a progression of undermining of property values, because ultimately, what is the indicium or protector of individual freedom? It's the ability to have property or the control of property, the use of property. I have no freedom if all of the things that I would want to use or control are subject to someone else's control. Basically, I'm a slave. They can tell me what I can eat. They can tell me where I can work or where I can't work, et cetera, and what I can wear, et cetera. This is Klaus Schwab. I'll have no property, and I'll love it, whatever. I guess you're going to give me drugs, so I will love this. Mind-altering drugs from the WHO. But that's the ultimate proposition of slavery. I own nothing. Oh, and by the way, I'm owned by somebody else. Right? Klaus Schwab doesn't mention that. Right? What about my personal ownership? Well, my personal ownership is defined in many ways by the things that I can control, such as food, right? Such as my own medical care. I don't have to listen to some clown from the FDA telling me what medicines I can take. Right? Personal health. You start adding these things up, and you can see, yes, all those elements of property are not simply contingent, but they're utterly necessary for me as a defining characteristic of what I am and how I can live, for heaven's sake. And every one of these has been eroded at the highest level in terms of the basic principles. And now we get to this one, which says, well, I can't even have a titular use and control of my own political structure. Because foreign invaders, egged on by foreign powers, or non-governmental entities, George Soros and God knows whoever is financing this nonsense, these people can run amok. And my claim to political property, control over my own boundaries of my own country, my own state, my own locality, my own city, whatever, wherever these people are coming, and everything that's tied in with that, well, now that's all been stripped away. And it's these foreigners in this instance that now have at least in principle, the property right. They can come and do what they want. They can demand services, which have to be financed by me, In Massachusetts, they were trying to get people in private homes to bring give the aliens shelter in their own private homes, because all the facilities in, I guess, eastern Massachusetts at least, are overwhelmed by this. I thought to myself, well, when will that be not simply voluntary because you're a good Samaritan unless you live in Martha's Vineyard? If you're in Martha's Vineyard, you kick them out right away. But if you're in eastern Massachusetts, now they're saying voluntarily. When will it become compulsory? Right? When will the burdens in certain areas become so great that the state or the local governments, or maybe even Washington, D.C., will tell the local citizens, well, you've got a home with a couple of extra rooms, therefore you have to take in 2 foreign families. Now, I look at that and say, well, that's perfectly natural. Isn't that a public use? If these aliens have come into this country and we're going to accept them, and then we have to have all these benefits, I certainly can't leave them out in the cold or whatever, doing it's too hot maybe, whatever. So isn't it a public use to take your property to house illegal aliens? And then what's the just compensation for that? Well, I don't know. I guess you have to pay. Someone will have to pay for their food, right? Will you be justly compensated as being the servant of these people? You got to clean the house. They're not going to do it. Think of the ramifications of this. And the interesting question is, well, number one, why not? Politicians have done things along this line in the past. But number two, what are the legal protections against it? And the whole concept of public use being now basically ephemeral, we don't know what it means. Some court will tell us. Years later, right? Years later, not right now, there's a litigation process, right? Lower courts will rule against. Maybe 10 years from now, we get to the Supreme Court and they say, well, those illegal aliens shouldn't have been housed there. Well, okay. Now what? We've got another 10 years of litigation to find out how much money we should finally be paid. Okay. All right. That's the situation. Well, property rights are, one would hope, something that are temporally bound. I want my property now, not 10 years from now. All right. And will I get, is it really compensation for me to get some money 10 years from now, having gone through all the stress and difficulty of housing the illegal aliens for 3 or 4 years? Who can compensate me for that?
Right, that loss of your life freedom, yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly. So you look at property in that sense, not simply the immediate physical use of a piece of land or a building, but all of the kind of psychic involvement that could be tied in with that as well. And that's Klaus Schwab, right? I won't know, I guess, but I'm going to be so propagandized that I'm going to be willing to accept all of this. And the answer is, well, he's probably close to being right because he has all of the legal apparatus set up to do these things. And the only question is the extent to which people will be unwilling to knuckle under to it. Well, they've knuckled under to quite a bit so far. So, we look at the basis of precedent, and this has happened. It's gotten worse and worse, systematically worse. And we have no quote unquote pushback. And now they're telling us what they're going to do. Boutros Ghali is telling us he can do all of these things to us. And that's what's amazing. I love the lockdown concept. They can have lockdowns worse than they had before, when all the evidence at the time, if you really looked at it, was that lockdowns were not effective. And then subsequently, it's been determined that they were not effective. They were extremely harmful. And that probably none of these state governors had the authority to do it anyway. And yet here's this clown in this foreign entity telling us we're going to have lockdowns worse than the ones we had, with certainly no more justification, and there's nothing we can do about it because the UN is going to tell us. He is going to tell us. Not even the UN, but he is going to tell us. And there's no one in this country saying, oh, well, don't come here and tell us that because we'll immediately put you in prison. That's what I find fascinating. You don't see anyone coming forward and saying, wait, we have this major problem. We put up with a lot of it from our own local tyrants, but we're certainly not going to accept this fellow pontificating from where is he pontificating? I don't know. Is he in Switzerland or whatever? Some foreign venue. And oh, well, okay, we're going to worry, but they're going to do this, and we're going to have to live with this, and et cetera, blah, 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 or die with it, as the case may be. Lockdowns killed a lot of people. Because of what? Because of some supposed treaty, which, by the way, we haven't, had submitted to the Senate yet. Okay, this is all up in the air, but they're already telling us what's going to happen, right? So there it is. And so if people, and you get back to gold and silver as money, well, we've already seen the precedent there. The reason that you have gold and silver being used as money in contracts now is because of a statute that's sitting there. 5119 D2, 31 USC 5119 D2, which allows for these kinds of contracts. And that's the exception from this long historical process that goes back to Roosevelt in 33 and 34, right? But what that historical record shows us is, they did this once before. And the only reason they're not doing it now, the only reason we're outside of that Roosevelt tyranny was because of this statute that was passed in 1977, by the way, 40 years later. All right? And it could be rescinded tomorrow morning. And then there were Supreme Court cases that say, that's fine. Gold clause contracts, you can't make a contract payable in gold or silver. That's already on the books, so-called gold clause cases. And then the next step would be, of course, a seizure. And we know how they handle the first seizure. If one wants to read a book I wrote or actually go back and look in the archives, you can find out the fraud that was involved there. You think they wouldn't give you the same fraud this time? Right? The gold had to be seized because of this massive crisis, this terrible emergency situation. Right? Oh, okay, that's the same story that will be told the second time around. Right? So, no, there have to be some kind of popular, number one, popular recognition of how they're being played here, and what the real danger is, that there are no sure and certain legal controls or protections. The legislatures and the courts have generated all sorts of weasel word exceptions and fictional powers, emergency powers, eminent domain for the national government, all nonsense. Preemption with respect to invasions of the states, all nonsense. But it's there. And people have to stand up and say just what I've said. This is all nonsense. That's what Abbott has to say. I'm not going along with this, says Abbott. I have this power. There it is in the Constitution. What are you going to do about it? But he won't. There's my bet.
It seems like it's coming to a head. We're going to watch that closely, as you are already, and we want to have you back on sooner than later to talk about potential remedies. And it sounds like we need to identify, we need to educate ourselves, at least to the point where more of the public know what you've explained to us here. And that's why we're putting this out there before our nearly 100,000 subscribers, and you're a big part of that. And we'd like to have you back on to talk about remedies, both just at the home front, what people can do in their own day-to-day lives, what they need to do in their local jurisdictions, what they need to do in terms of supporting any emerging leaders who are standing up, and be part of that movement to reclaim what we can at this point. And your help at giving us the solid background of where we've come from is not encouraging yet, but it's at least an exhortation of sanity that we're grateful for here. All of our viewers are grateful for your presence with us. And if people want to follow your work, Dr. Vieira, where should they check out your writings that you have done?
Well, right now they can go to News with Views, one word, newswithviews.com. And there's an archive. Look up on the writer's link, and my name will come up, and everything that I've produced, at least for that site, is there in the archive, including some of the topics we just talked about.
Good. Oh, excellent. Okay. And we would like, if we could get back on your calendar soon, to talk about remedies, imperfect as they are, but the things that people can take steps starting today, because analysis paralysis, or just being overwhelmed with the magnitude and how long in the tooth this problem is, how deep the rot has gone, is good to know. It doesn't necessarily move people to effective action, and we need to find ways that we can take effective action in our individual lives and together. So we're grateful for your presence here, and always, on behalf of all of our viewers, thank you for joining us on Liberty and Finance.
Well, thank you, Daniel. All right. Bye-bye.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for January 29th through February 5th, 2024, while supplies last. This week we have silver Valcambi or Asahi 100-ounce bars at just $1.39 over spot per ounce. We also feature pre-1933 gold $10 and $20 Liberties at $89 over melt and $139 over melt, respectively. Next, backdated 1-ounce silver maples are at $3.75 over spot with a minimum order of 50. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.